History Bite is presented by John Hanson, who's going to talk about his new book, Reading the Gravestones of Old New England. The graveyards of Old New England hold a great range of poetic messages in the epitaphs etched into the gravestones, each one a profound expression of emotion, culture, religion, and literature. These epitaphs are old, but their themes are timeless: mourning and faith, grief and hope, loss and memory. Mr. Hanson is a native of Williamstown. In his book, he tells the story of his years-long reader's walk among these old gravestones and shares some of the learning he's gained along the way. Most of the cemeteries he writes about are in the Pioneer Valley or the Berkshires. He reports that he had a very productive field trip to Amherst's West Cemetery in the fall, and he is delighted to report that Amherst has a quite wonderful variety of epitaphs with excellent and compelling examples of every type that can be found across these old burial grounds. His work has been presented to the Association of Gravestone Studies based in Greenfield, among other venues. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming out. With an audience like this, it's actually good for me because this makes it a seminar, not a lecture. So please don't hesitate to ask questions as I go, and I'll certainly try to. My afternoon is clear. We can stick around for Q&A afterwards. But I'll try to go neither too fast nor too slow. So thank you for the introduction. This has been a hobby of mine ever since I was a kid. I'm not quite sure why, though I have some theories. I should say at the very outset, I'm actually sorry that my friend Bob Drinkwater from the AGS is not here. He was really sort of a mentor of mine as I decided to get serious with this work, and he and I have often compared notes. There's a lot of interest in gravestone studies in one way or another. People like Bob represent a deep scholarship on iconography and the design and the carvers themselves. Obviously, genealogists and local historians get involved. But what I've discovered as I got into it, very little has been written about the verses themselves. If anything, they tend to be dismissed as sort of sentimental doggerel and overlooked. But to me, they're fascinating and well worth paying attention to. If you think about it, every single one was chosen uniquely on the occasion of utmost gravity and importance, the death of a spouse or a family member or loved one or neighbor. So I started reading them, and the first thing I began to notice was the wide range of source texts that actually show up. And then I started wondering about who chose those source texts and how they got here. I spent half my time in Cambridge, and I've really never gone through the graveyards in the immediate area of Boston because it's less impressive to me to find obscure literature close to the universities and centers of publishing. You know, when you see Robert Burns in Becket, Mass., then you start to say, well, how did this object get out here? So I want to talk about all of those topics today using examples from Amherst West Cemetery. All right. Early on, the earliest gravestones are pretty stark. Most of my collecting is from sort of 1740 to the early 18-teens or 20s. Before that, this is about all you got. In fact, before these, it was typically an undressed field stone, maybe a wooden stake, all of which have been long lost. But you get these very simple carvings, though interestingly, with an attribution to the son, who wants to get his name in there. He probably paid for it out of the probating, so he deserved it. And after about the 1820s, the whole profession, the whole funeral profession, including the carving of gravestones, was getting a little more mass-produced, a little more industrialized. So to me, those are the interesting decades between about 1740 and 1820 or so, when you can really see the craftsmanship and the individual choices. So that's where I'll begin. Okay, by Bible verses were amongst the very first additions to gravestones. No surprise, right? They would be familiar to everyone from a life of church-going and reading. They were comfortably orthodox. I mean, who would argue with putting a Bible verse on a stone? And they were also near to hand. There were pulpit Bibles in every meeting house. And most households, once you got above subsistence farming, you would have a family Bible that would be read not just on the Sundays, but devotional readings throughout the week. And so as a result, I tend to find a lot of Psalms or Lamentations or the Gospels in any of these graveyards. This quotation, sorry about the shadow. If Bob were here, he should be. This is from Job, Job 9:12. Sometimes the passage will be explicitly identified, not in this case. But though I expect any contemporary reader would have recognized it quickly. As you read it, I think, at least to my ears, it's not a particularly comforting verse. But I think for Mary Dickinson survivors, it would have been a message of respectful and appropriate resignation to God's will, which was very much a theme that was struck over and over. So I think this would have been a very appropriate choice. So this is another from Job. Okay, this is, from 14. And Job 14 is a very intense, sustained examination of what it means to live amidst the absolute certainty of death. Verse 1 is the one that famously states, "Man that is born of a woman is of few days and full of trouble." And verse 10 says that in comparison with a cut tree that might yet grow again, man dieth and wasteth away. So I think a selection, perfect, thank you. I think any selection from Job 14 is meant to be considered very seriously by the reader. Over in Montague in 1777, I found a minister who chose verse 15 for the grave of his infant child. "Thou destroyest the hope of man," which I think is a pretty doleful lesson for a minister to choose for the grave of his own son. But this frequent choice of Job introduces a theme I'm not going to give you a long lecture, you'll be relieved to hear, on the theology of the time, but it is fair to mention this deeply conflicted attitude that the New England Puritans and their Congregationalist descendants had towards the prospect of death. And I mention it now because you'll see it playing over and over here. On the one hand, they went through life, all of life, with an intense, visceral, unremitting fear of death because of the terrible prospect of eternal damnation, while simultaneously viewing death as a welcome relief for the earthbound soul, and the prospect of paradise. So these two contrasting attitudes show up everywhere in contemporary devotional writing, poetry, samplers, sermons and journals, and certainly on the gravestones. Just one more scripture example, apt under the circumstances, since poor Solomon Boltwood was thrown from a bridge while he was helping build it. It's from Matthew 24, in which Jesus admonishes his disciples to be ready at any hour for the end of time and judgment. And that they would certainly have known that. Anyone would have, a contemporary reader would have recognized that verse. The same verse was chosen over in Worthington in 1820, also, by the way, on a sudden death. In that case, a boy who fell into a well. If you squint, you can see the carver's name down here. It's not common, but it does happen. I guess a little bit of 18th century marketing. This verse for a sudden death, a sudden drowning, raises the question of who chose these verses. I have no doubt that sometimes the deceased may have chosen their own epitaph in advance based on a favorite passage from the Bible or a hymn or their reading. But I think that was the exception, not the rule. Death often came quickly and prematurely in these towns. Not everyone would have planned carefully ahead. So in all likelihood, I suspect the choice fell to the surviving family perhaps advised by the minister, and sometimes, though not conclusively, by the carver himself. Okay. Another familiar category of epitaph is one so familiar that I have just come to refer to it as the classic. I'm sure any of you would recognize the, as you are now, so once was I. This is a particularly word-for-word perfect example of Reuben Ingramstone. I find it all over. A lot of ink has been spilled, a lot of blogs are out there in the cloud right now with explanations about the source of this verse. And we don't know. It's lost in the mist of time. There are Roman tombs with Viator, Viator, passerby, passerby. What you are now, I once was. What I am, you will be. So we know it goes back at least that long. You can find it in Florence, in I think it's Santa Maria Novella. Masaccio has a beautiful trinity. If you look at an image of it, down below there's a memento mori skeleton painted, and below that is essentially as I am now, so you will be. And I know I'm in Robert Frost country here. He has a wonderful, wonderful poem, In a Disused Graveyard, which plays on the notion that the stones say over and over, you'll be here any minute now, but no one comes anymore. I recommend it to reading. I know you can't read this, so I'll read it for you. This is one of two from outside of Amherst that I'll share with you today. This is actually in Longmeadow. Hello, John. Hello, Pam. And I'll read it to you. Hear you, young, so am I, therefore all prepare to die. The finest flesh is dust. Prepare for follow me you must. And this is 12-year-old Elizabeth Keep. Now obviously, even though it's in the first person, compared to the third person as you are now, da-da-da, obviously she didn't write this, someone wrote it for her. It's also interesting that on Elizabeth Keep they use the present tense, not the past tense. It's as I am right now. And also she addresses it not just to any one reader, but to all the young. I only mention this because what you see here is some local person taking the familiar theme and customizing it. They're making it fit just for Elizabeth Keep. And I could show you dozens of variations on this theme. Obviously this verse, this concept was core to these people, and they adapted it. The point I want to emphasize, though, as commonplace as it is, there was nothing cliched about it at the time that it was chosen. I touched on this a moment ago, but everyone knew that death was a terrible risk if your soul was not well prepared. They had this notion of preparation drilled into them every time they went to church. Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, to give just one of countless representative examples, warned, there is nothing that keeps the wicked men at any one moment out of hell but the mere pleasure of God. 'Tis nothing but God's hand that holds you from falling into the fire every moment. There is no reason to be given why you have not dropped into hell since you arose this morning. And so to be prepared for that 24/7 was a very well understood specific task. Now again, I won't digress. There was huge debate at this time between old light traditionalists and new light revivalists about how to prepare, what it meant to prepare, but there was no doubt at all about the importance of preparation. So I only emphasize it because this notion of prepare for death and follow me, whenever it was chosen, and it was chosen often, had a very specific, direct meaning to the readers. These verses were meant to be read by the survivors and taken seriously. Okay. The language of 18th century hymns and psalms is another common source for these. Like the Bible verses, they would have been familiar, they would certainly have been orthodox. Hymns formed a very important part of the literary lives of these people. It wasn't just sung or read on Sundays. They were part of the home devotional readings of a household. You find examples of that over and over. And what's interesting about this one is, at least to me, is that here again we're called to attend. You know, it's a doleful tomb, living men come view the ground where you must shortly lie. But the first thing you notice is just the meter is smoother. It's clearly more poetic. So it's a different language. Anyone happen to recognize it? Anyone here sing in their church choir?
Yeah.
Isaac Watts, the father of English hymnody. He lived from 1674 to 1748. He wrote, he didn't write the music, he wrote some 750 psalms and hymns, many of which are still in use today. They were incredibly popular. I cannot overstate how central Watts was to the literary lives of these people. He was a very good self-marketer. He advocated that children who do very well at their lessons should be given a copy of his hymns and psalms. You hear countless accounts in diaries of the devotional reading. He shows up in commonplace books, the books where women and men would manually transcribe their favorite passages. And when you read it in context, a funeral thought, yeah, that's the first line. But again, as any reader of David Blodgett's Epitaph would know, it then goes on to say a couple of things. This notion that princes, despite all your towers, you'll be lowered as low as I, is a very common theme. And then you get this great journey of movement from downward to the tomb, and then suddenly our soul is flying up above the sky. This sense of movement, the sense of drama is very, very typical of Watts. And you can see why he was so popular and why so many of these people would have taken it to heart. I should mention, because my friend Sam is here, who first told me this anecdote, and you'll be pleased to know, Sam, I was able to validate it on the subject of how universally popular Watts was. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, the commanding officer told them as the British approached, "Give 'em Watts, give 'em Watts." And what he meant was, in addition to the ball and the powder, you had to put a little stuff, wadding in. And he was confident that every man under his command would have a tiny little waistcoat-sized copy of Watts on him. And so he did. So they did.
John?
Yes?
I did spend a lot of time in choirs growing up, and I can think of about a dozen hymns that tune would go to. It's just the way that it's written.
Yeah. It's to the point where I get enthusiastic about this stuff. You all are being very polite and indulgent. You can usually tell Watts coming because there's something about the lilt, there's something about the rhyming. Here, for example, this is another Watts, which I think is, of course, quite appropriate to talk about timorous worms in a place where, obviously, Joseph Dickinson is now food for worms. What's great about this one is, Christ's presence makes death easy. What's interesting about this one is, compared to the dire warnings of the classic, here, we shouldn't fear death, we should be grateful. Why do we dread? The point is, we're going to lose all of our pains and groans and dying strife. Oh, if my Lord would come, I'd be in a hurry. I'm in a rush to get past the iron gate. It's literally like Watts is chiding us for holding on to this world, shaking his head at our foolishness and fear, when in fact there's a great future ahead of us. Diametrically opposed to the message of the classic, but right at the same time, just contemporaneous and overlapping. Last Watts, but that I just like this because it shows the two not only contemporaneous but within the same family. This is Phoebe. Relic means widow, means you outlived Reuben. Consort usually refers to wife who died first. So Phoebe was the relic. She died 15 years after Reuben. And remember, Reuben was the one with that absolutely letter-perfect version of the classic. And here, very different tone. This is, there's some overlap that, the body is brittle, it's fragile, it's not going to last forever. But here, there's a great sense of confidence that, yes, time's going to pass quickly, but I'm going to keep my end in sight, I'm going to follow wisdom's way, and I am going to leave life's tempestuous sea and be wafted to this peaceful shore. And this is husband and wife. I'll go back for a second. Back to the point of choosing, and I mentioned the Commonplace book. It strikes me as entirely possible that Phoebe had transcribed this passage for Watts, so that her survivors would know and would put what Mom had written down. I can't know, of course, but it seems plausible. I guess I would just say that somehow reading this husband and wife side by side just makes me think that we're almost learning something about Reuben and Phoebe, even if the message is sort of pretty faint after all these years. Okay, so the classic Bible hymns, those are fairly unsurprising sources of text. There are other sources I found that I wasn't necessarily expecting, including 100 years worth of English and American lyric poetry. Some of the works are from famous authors whose names have endured to this day: Shakespeare, Milton, Alexander Pope, Burns, Samuel Johnson. Others were clearly popular in their day and are now completely forgotten. And others, as far as I can tell, are entirely anonymous. For example, with this one, 4 months and 8 days, happy infant, early blessed, early rescued from the cares. What are we to make of this notion of how fortunate Philip Smith is? Well, I found the source. It's an anonymous poem called Epitaph on an Infant. It was, I found it anthologized in it's called Murray's English Reader, which was a very popular contemporary book, sort of like a Bartlett's. It anthologized exemplary things for you to read. It was chosen for the grave of 2 little children over in Becket in 1784. And I found it transcribed in the Commonplace book of a doctor at the Boston Athenaeum from the late 1700s. So clearly, it was in print and readable all across the Commonwealth in the last decades of the 1700s. You don't need to read the whole thing, though. It's kind of interesting if you like that sort of stuff. It's a dialogue between the deceased infant and a sort of omniscient narrator. Initially, the babe is bemoaning the fact that I never enjoyed the pleasures of life. But the response from the narrator is, no, no, no. Be grateful that you died before you had to suffer through life on this vain and sickly globe. And so in the end, the baby goes back to rest, innocent and happy. So I think the choice of this particular verse to express the parents' feelings on the death of a child, I hope was comforting to the Smiths. And obviously it had meaning to them. Another message that you see very often is really quite different, which is to kiss the rod, accept the will of God, and accept your fate. This is perhaps at least a little bit of a happier tone for that. Here's another piece of poetry. This is from one of those writers who was very famous in his day, though now largely forgotten. Extra credit if anyone knows James Harvey. He was born 1714 to 1758, educated at Oxford. He became an Anglican minister, flirted with Methodism, but he came back to the real church. And he became a very, very well-regarded parish priest and a prolific writer of devotional texts. I've really come to appreciate through my work that this thriving market of middle-brow work, we'll come actually to a second of how that market worked. His most famous book, which is not quoted here, is called Meditations Among the Tombs, very typical of this graveyard literature of the time, in which he describes a visit to an empty church, and there, in very simple language and commonplace imagery, he looks at all the tombs and shares what he calls a train of meditations seriously and mournfully pleasing on the need to prepare for death and on the uncertainty of life. This particular passage is from another book he wrote called Reflections on a Flower Garden, and this poem is like interjected into the middle of the prose. Here, he's not in a church, he's in a flower garden, but he's musing on how everything in the garden gives way from one season to the next, reminding the reader very gently that the same will be true of your life. Everything must come to an end. And I'd never met Harvey before this. I think I still have him pretty much all to myself. Reading Harvey is a lonely pastime. But I can really see how the early New Englanders embraced him. There's a scholar, Kevin Hayes, who's written a lot about colonial reading habits, and I'll quote him on this subject. While modern readers may find it difficult to understand Harvey's immense popularity, it becomes comprehensible when seen within the context of early American devotional practice. He helped revitalize colonial women's closet devotions. And here's the important part. Imagining one's inherent sinfulness had become increasingly difficult by the end of the 18th century. There's one thing to have Jonathan Edwards in front of you in 1730 explaining how you're about to burn, but it lost some impact. So that's my interpolation, by the way. Readers needed tangible, concrete subject matter upon which they could focus their religious meditations. Harvey provided many examples of everyday subjects, which could be used for spiritual meditation. And that makes a lot of sense to me. And clearly, this little passage resonated with Nancy Nichols, or rather her parents. She died at 3 years. But I suspect Mrs. Elizabeth Nichols knew Harvey well. Okay, here's a verse from a poet whose fate has lasted a little better. I'm interested, as a recovering English major, anyone recognize this? Let's always see the same hands. John Milton, okay? Milton, it's from Paradise Lost. Milton, 1608 to 1674, poet, man of letters, also a civil servant under Cromwell. He wrote at a time of enormous political and religious turmoil, oddly parallel to the political and religious turmoil going on in the late 1700s in New England. I think this is just a wonderful verse. The context in Paradise Lost, you notice it's book 11, we're fairly well into the story. Adam and Eve are about to be expelled. And the speaker here is the Son of God intervening on their behalf as they humbly seek forgiveness. It's just a marvelous text. And you can see how his words on behalf of Adam and Eve are absolutely being invoked on behalf of Eunice Parsons. I would emphasize that I have not found this passage selected or excerpted or in any of these anthologies. So whoever picked this verse knew Milton, had read Milton, and had this verse had made an impression. Candidly, I respect Milton more than I really like him. I realize I've offended people, but I think it's just wonderful language. And the idea that it's the subtlety that Adam and Eve's fall contains the seeds of their redemption, that their sighs and prayers have a more pleasing savor than if they had never sinned, because they are contrite, is very theologically rich, and I am sure was meant to be contemplated by the readers of Eunice Parsons' Gravestone. Again, this was chosen to be read by people in Amherst. Another recognizable category of epitaph is what I call bespoke. And thanks to Google, a pretty obscure verse. If it's Edward Young, it'll turn up Edward Young. And if you never get a match, if you never get a hit, that starts to get me thinking that it's bespoke. And by that I mean it was an original composition, unique to a particular death, a particular grave, and the work of, at some point, a now usually anonymous and lost original composer. So to me, these are really the most interesting and engaging ones, because you can't get closer to the act of choosing an epitaph than creating one. It would have been someone you knew in the community or in the family. I like this one a lot. I wish I could read the rest, but you notice the pattern goes down, and at some point maybe we can figure out some way to raise the stone and reset it and figure out how it ends. It's a very traditional message to the bereaved not to mourn, but just as with that epitaph on a dead infant, one thing I've learned in this work is to try to read with empathy through the ears and eyes of these people, their particular religiosity and their rates of infant mortality and so forth, not with modern ears. But I read this and I thought how grief counselors today would advise against controlling your tears and suppressing your grief. But again, that was then, and the point was to submit to God's will. I also have to draw attention to, isn't that a great soul effigy? I won't go off on a long digression here, but the quick iconography is that the winged skull from early on, that's the triumph of death. That represents the moment at which you die. Over time, it became more stylized. A lot of people refer to them as angels, but we in the trade refer to them as soul effigies, because that's meant to represent the soul on its way to paradise. Later into the 1800s, you get into the willow and urn. To me, this is actually a semi-interesting example of the willow with a kind of a happening soul effigy. Okay, speaking of soul effigies, this is the one that's, one other stone I have that's not from Amherst. It's up in New Salem, and if you've never been, I really recommend you buzz up to New Salem. This carver did about 8 or 10 stones there, all with that very similar look. And to the best of my knowledge, nowhere else. If Bob were here, he could keep me honest, but I don't think he worked elsewhere. I just don't know where this artist came up with this sort of extraterrestrial face and hair and that complicated incised circle. Just marvelous. And this is absolutely a bespoke verse. What's interesting to me, and by the way, that it's for the first reverend, for the founding reverend of New Salem, makes sense because you often will find bespoke on the minister's stone. He would have been prominent enough in town to merit a special composition. It's interesting, I mentioned before about the equal in dust. Remember Watts gave us that image of princes and their towers will fall. No distinctions can we make. You know, very conventional, but sincerely felt sentiment at the time. And that notion that faith forbids the rising sigh, very appropriate for a minister's voice. That if you have good faith and you have no reason to sigh, this one, again, I'll never know, but it does seem conceivable to me that Reverend Kendall, once he's into his 80 years, might have penned this himself. It certainly sounds like the composition of someone very familiar with the devotional literature and hymnody of the era. Could have been written by a successor. We'll never know, but I do enjoy speculating from time to time. Okay. And again, stop me if I'm going too fast. The last major category that I want to talk about is sort of the opposite of bespoke. These are recurring. These are verses that show up across time and distance. And there's a couple of different types of them. There are some that appear so often that I kind of catch and release. I've stopped counting them at this point. Others recur occasionally, sort of like that dying infant. You know, you'll see it occasionally, but across space. Others very, very locally, 2 or 3 times in one burial ground, maybe in an adjacent town. These two are squarely from the first category. I cannot believe that here in Amherst you have a twofer of the 2 most frequently recurring, borderline cliched epitaphs that exist. affliction sore a long time I bore, physicians all in vain. Can't swing a cat without hitting this in most of these graveyards. And it makes sense. I mean, again, back to my empathetic reading. It's a comforting notion, you know, to the survivors. Yes, it was painful, but you did what you could. You got me physicians, and now I'm in a better place. It was God's pleasure. I will surely rise again. I mean, I do think it was meant to be consoling to the bereaved. Friends and physicians could not save. This is the one I call the granddaddy of them all. It's everywhere. It starts in the early 1700s. It turns up in Australia and Singapore in the 1850s. I mean, gosh, David Copperfield, Charles Dickens refers to it. Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain made fun of it in the 1870s because it had become such a cliche. My own favorite example is from a music hall song called Oil on the Brain from the early days of the oil wildcatting. Affliction sore, long time she bore, physicians were in vain. It just became cliche. It was everywhere, and we have no idea where it began. Again, I can only state that it obviously expressed emotion and gave comfort to people for ever and ever. I cannot find a source author for either one, though obviously they were created at one time. Some commentator said, it's a pity the author could not collect royalties on this. This is one in that middle category of semi-recurring, very simple verse. This is one, every time I see it, I sort of smile and go, yes, dry up your tears. There's a couple versions in Williamstown. It appears often in the eastern part of the state, and really all around New England. So it's, it obviously existed in print. I've never found a contemporary book with it. I'll come to that in a second. But, you know, someone took the time to write it. I can understand the popularity of this, too. There's this sense of, look, don't worry. I'm okay now. You go back home, get on with your lives. It's going to be okay. And there are variations. There's another one that says much the same, but it begins, farewell, dear friends. And in that one, we're still standing there, but the deceased is the one waving us farewell as he or she moves on. You know, in Depart, you can see the deceased knows we're standing there, moping around, crying, and they're like, nope, time to go. We need to get back to the world. I said I can't find these texts originally. I am convinced there once was an anthology of verses appropriate for epitaphs. It had to exist. It was something that a minister might have owned. Stone carvers might have had it in there as a sample book, something to refer to. I've seen traces of handwritten collections that they did for themselves. But I just haven't found it. It is my white whale as a book collector and as a scholar. I think it would have been fairly ephemeral and didn't last. And then this one is very regional. I found it only twice, both times in Amherst. So someone composed this right here, okay? Probably for Timothy Green. It's interesting, you know, he died at the age of 74. So what Timothy Green says, even if you're advancing years, even if you're healthy and robust, you are in fact tottering around the grave. He would know because he made it that long. And then here you find it just a couple years later. I don't know, you may know if there's a family connection between Dickinson's and Green's. It may have been as simple as the Dickinsons knew the Greens, at least had read the Stone and liked it. But you know, someone, I'll never know who, did take the time to compose it. And back to my missing book, and really all of these texts that you've seen, to me it brings home a vanished world of writing, yes, but then printing, distributing these tracts and almanacs and pamphlets, as well as these anthologies. There would have been distribution via some shops, but also traveling peddlers. There's a lot of scholarship about how the peddlers would always throw a few religious books into their bag and trade it as they went around their rounds. All this literature that was just a little bit ephemeral and has turned to dust, not unlike Dorothy Dickinson. But I keep looking for it, and occasionally I get lucky. Okay, now we're well into the 1800s. One last piece of poetry for you. A lovely passage, I think. As you read it, the sense of farewell, usually a conflict of joys and fears. So even this fallen world at least is given some benefit of the doubt for joys. Light and shade alternate dwells, but now I'm bidding, frankly, a relieved and grateful farewell to this inconstant world. This is a real extra credit question. Anyone recognize this author? Good, because I would have been embarrassed if you had. Anna Laetitia Barbeau. I'm going to spend a minute on Barbeau. She's one of the many, many biographies that I never would have stumbled across without this project. This is from a poem called Death of the Virtuous. Barbeau lived from 1743 to 1825. Very widely read poet, essayist, and educator. She married one Rochemont Barbeau, who was a Huguenot exile in England. He had, unfortunately, a melancholy disposition and later went mad and drowned himself. The couple could not conceive a child, so she prevailed upon her brother, who was also her literary agent, to give them one of his. So she took her nephew on as a son. You can't make this stuff up. The thing is, she was a tremendous woman of letters in her time. Amongst other things, she was a very accomplished editor. She edited the 50-volume series called The British Novelists in 1810, which basically established the canon of who is a great British novelist, and it's been built on ever since, very explicitly. She wrote an introduction to each author. I'm embarrassed to say I've known Johnson's Lives of the Poets all my life, and I'd never heard of this work until I found out about Barbeau. What's interesting, though, is her lessons. She wrote a lot of children's literature, lessons for children, and hymns and prose for children. Became sort of a curse. They became so popular that by the Victorian era, she was just viewed as a sentimental writer of children's doggerel, no longer taken seriously, not perhaps the first woman academic to have that fate. But what's interesting is that she really is starting to make a comeback in academia. You can read about her, she's being studied. I think slowly she's being reestablished as getting the credit she deserves. This particular poem, not perhaps her finest work, was set to music, became a popular hymn. So Dickinson could have come across it either in the form of a hymn or in one of these many anthologies, or quite possibly owned a copy of Barbeau's poetry. But anyway, so here we are in 1813 with these bright scenes, bright and sweet scenes. It would seem that the dire message of the classic has finally lost out, once and for all, to this more optimistic attitude. But, what a good audience. Yep, here we are in 1812, and granted it's a variant, but 3 times within about 4 years in the West Cemetery, a woman's epitaph is the identical 4 lines. And there just aren't many mothers today who would pick an epitaph about draw near. Not long ago I was with you, and soon you'll be with me. That old cautionary message is still in play. I found that the identical to Rubens' verse, the absolutely original verse up in Lanesborough in, I think, 1840. So, then as now, attitudes change over time, but not overnight, and not immediately. And I just continue to find it fascinating to see these different attitudes playing out simultaneously, carved in perpetuity in these graveyards. I will say on this one, it is worth noting that, you know, in the 18-teens, these people would have died at home. There would have been an open casket, not home burial, obviously they made it to the cemetery. But it would have been a lot less shocking for those children to consider this verse than it might be to our ears today. So, with that, I would be delighted to take any questions. I know I went through a lot in a little while. Anything I can say?
I'm curious, and I didn't ask you before, but if you have any sense of how many stones would have had epitaphs versus stones that would just be plain with dates?
Great question. I usually say at the outset, this is not an empirical study. I don't have a lot of statistics, but I have sort of looked through a couple of times to answer that question. I would say roughly 20% is about right to me, would have it. A couple of things. It was expensive. Carvers carved by the line or sometimes by the character. So you had to really choose to invest in that. I think there was also an element of you had to have something you wanted to say. You really were leaving a message for the community, and clearly not everyone did. But I think it's about that. John?
In terms of the message, did you come up, and they may not have fit the literary other than bespoke, but anyone leaving a parting shot comment, either about them or about those reading?
Yes. It's a dead serious question. And again, sorry. That's oh, you're killing me. A couple of things. First of all, I see read of these collections of quaint and curious epitaphs. Yes, they exist. I actually think some of them are apocryphal. I have rarely seen them in the graveyards I go to. But you know, it's about, you know, my wife lies here, my household is finally at peace, that kind of thing. But very rarely. The one that comes immediately to mind, though, is in Lee. A quick aside, while I hate the quaint and curious, I am deeply indebted to people from the late 1800s who went around making transcriptions, knowing that the weathering and just, you know, that these were fading. And there's one magnificent one in Lee that's completely illegible today. I found it. You can't read a word of it, but thanks to this guy, Dorval Miller Wilcox, who did the transcribing back around 1900. You read called the slide. The husband commissioned it for the wife. It was a big, long, lots and lots of text. First part's kind of a nice sentimental poem. The bottom part is another kind of sentimental poem. In the middle, he talks about, you've gone to a better place, I'm paraphrasing, far away from the aspersion of tongues, and he goes on for about 3 lines about how this woman's life was obviously made miserable in Lee by the fellow townspeople. And Cornelius Fessenden paid good money to have that left behind for those people to read. And I would love to know that backstory, and I've never been able to learn. So there are other times when perhaps some of the hymns chosen really emphasize how worthless this world is. And yeah, you kind of get the feeling they might be referring to, you know, the town manager or something. Sir?
And some of them could be called, are related to folk songs. You have folk songs that talk about death.
Oh, yes.
In ways very, very similar to what you've got.
Yeah, I have found only one example of a verse of an epitaph which now lives on as a bluegrass song. Long time traveler. In Congregationalist New England, I don't think it flowed the other way. You know, I don't find secular songs being quoted here, but I'll bet as you move down into Appalachia and so forth, I'll bet there's a lot more.
Yes.
A lot more of that.
Yes. In areas where most of the people aren't literate anyway.
Yeah, that's actually a great
So-
point too.
so-
I didn't want to belabor it, but as you'll have seen, now Amherst has always been obviously a center of learning, closer to the Northampton and centers of religion and trade and so forth. But even here, as you've seen, the spelling can be pretty erratic. But these were very literate people. There was a strong reading culture. They bought these books from these peddlers. And, you know, when I find Edward Young and Milton and Shakespeare, forget downtown Berkshire County, but in those barrier towns along the ridge, those texts had to work hard to get there, but they were read. Any other questions or comments? Well, I'm sorry, Sam, go ahead, please.
A lot of the stones the headstones you showed were late 18th century. The variety of the carving, you can see some of it might have been from the same hand, but it looked like there were several different stone carvers. And I'm just wondering, maybe someone else in the audience would know, how large a town was Amherst in, say, 1790 or 1800? I'm just wondering if it could support several different carvers.
I can't answer your first question. What I can tell you, your observation is quite right. Even in small towns, you see more than one hand. And the answer to that one, Sam, is it was no one's full-time job. These were stonemasons, bricklayers. It was only, back to my earlier point about the professionalization, it's not until well into the 1800s that it would have been a full-time job. Some exceptions. There were families who actually passed on the tools and the trade for several generations where it was their dominant one. But I think in even a decent-sized town, if there was more than one guy who could build you a chimney, there was more than one guy who could carve you a tombstone. Gravestones. Yes?
Why on the same stone was there ye, was spelled out, one with a little e like an X?
The superscript, yeah.
And the other ye just below it was fully.
Could have been my transcription error, but we should look back and check.
No, it was on the stone, I believe.
Well, I suspect you're right, because I tried to proofread carefully. The carvers were also literate, but have you ever had a tradesman who did, why did you do that there and that there? I have an electrician just like that. And you find these little flaws everywhere, or inconsistencies, and in some cases outright flaws. There's one in Great Barrington, Mass, where he screwed up the first line so badly he just did it again below, without even rubbing out the first one.
But the little exponent use seemed to be, on other stones, like they saw maybe a space saver or something, but on the same, but then on the same stone.
It's just inconsistent. I just don't think they felt as compelled to be consistent.
But that wasn't a style to have the little.
No, there are several. Is this up? Yes, but it was not a rule, clearly. You do see the ye often, and certainly, someone said it over here, when they ran out of space on a line, they would superscript to squeeze more characters into the line.
Except this was a little.
Yeah, I understand.
I'm so curious that, the two.
You think about imagination and empathy. Busy day in the shop, got distracted, forgot to superscript it, not going to start all over again, just go on to the next line. It could be as simple as that. I doubt that was intentional in any way.
No deletes.
Yeah, no whiteout. No whiteout. Yes?
I was just going to add to you, there's a lot of, I found 3 stones in West Cemetery that have like a letter above because they forgot a letter. So it happens.
Carrot.
So like, it's like T-H-E, and they forgot like I, and it's up above. So like that, they do that. There's like at least 3 examples in West alone.
Yeah.
Anyway, really.
Okay, well then listen, let me just close with a couple thoughts if I could. We're right at the hour. First of all, thank you for your time and interest. You're a lovely audience. I have not transcribed every stone in the West Cemetery, nor have I had time to share all the ones I did. So please, if you come across something out there that strikes your interest, drop me an email, let me know. That's the website, just drop me an email. I'd welcome hearing about it. Two things I want to leave you with. One is just to really don't dismiss this as doggerel. You know, hear and appreciate the voices of these ordinary people making these very intentional and personal choices, and in some cases creating something original. These are not decoration. They were meant for the survivors, for us to read and attend to contemplate. And also, I hope I've given you at least a little bit of a glimpse into the world of reading and writing and publishing and printing and all the different ways in which these texts made it under the ears of these early Amherst residents, and from there onto these stones. I think that's a wonderful part of all this. And if you found it interesting, I'd be more than happy to sell you a book, or you can order one online. Thank you all very much.
The next History Bite is March 25th. We'll hear from Julie Dubrow about her new book. I think it's still, she's still writing it. The Unlikely Marriage of Elaine Goodale and Charles Alexander Eastman. So Julie has been here before, and she should be really quite fascinating, and sounds like a great talk. And I encourage you to, if you're not members of the Historical Society, you can join online, and any financial contributions will be greatly appreciated, so please donate.